One thing that you see in the disco era is you see really, really, really long records. This is a 12-inch single. On a normal album, you might have like 5, 6 songs on one side. On a 12-inch single, it's one song. And it's just spread out across the whole record. This is one song. I guess it's only about this much of it is the actual song. The rest is just silence. Because the grooves can be spaced out a little bit wider, you can have the waveform deflect a little bit further. And disco DJs like that, but you can also have longer tracks, 7 minutes, 15 minutes for a single song. From every account that I've read, people really liked it for the bass. It was not the high end, it was not how sparkly the cymbals sounded, it was how hard the drums kicked. 45 RPM records like this, they go past the needle at a faster speed. They're spinning at 45 revolutions per minute, as opposed to 33 1/3 revolutions per minute, which you will get this. And when you have more linear distance passing underneath the needle, you can capture more high-frequency content, right? So naturally, that would assume if you were interested in high-frequency content, you record everything in 45 revolutions per minute, or even 78 revolutions per minute. But if you were trying to squeeze much longer tracks onto a record, can I fit a 30-minute song on one side of a record so that the DJ can use the restroom while the night is going on or something like that? That's recorded in 33 1/3 because they're trying to squeeze as much of the song on a single side of the record. But if you can space the grooves, the individual grooves, a little bit further from each other, then you can have big side-to-side deflections, as opposed to a lot of really, really fine, high-frequency vibrations. We have a lot of low-frequency, large vibrations. And that's what a 12-inch single allows you to do. You can actually physically fit that on a record. And you get louder kicks, louder drums, louder bass guitar, that sort of thing. In a disco, in a very, very sort of well-appointed disco in the late 70s or in the early 80s, this is kind of how they would be set up. You'd have the turntables actually pretty far away from you. Just far enough for you to be able to sort of like put the record down like this. You would be able to see the needle at eye level coming down onto the record. So you can see how that's actually pretty ergonomic, right? I put the record down, I can very, very clearly see the grooves. I can put it, and I can see whether if I'm lined up the needle right onto the record. You'd see something like this, which is a Thorens TD125. It's a Swiss made turntable. And it's called a belt drive turntable. This is actually a belt drive turntable right here. There's a small motor that's attached to a belt around the platter, and as that motor spins, it's just pulling the platter along with it. So small motor, small radius, driving a large platter. That motor, it vibrates as it spins, right? You don't want vibration to make its way into the needle because otherwise you hear it. Thanks to the fact that the only thing connecting the motor to the larger platter is a belt, is this rubber belt, you kind of get this vibration isolation. The motor is vibrating, but the platter itself isn't vibrating. Now, you might have a subwoofer somewhere that's like bouncing the whole club, and that's a different problem. But that's one of the upsides. Hip-hop DJs needed something else. When you look at a hip-hop DJ, they're actually touching the record, right? And Grandmaster Flash over there, he was one of the DJs that was actually touching the surface of the record. Disco DJs would not do that. Disco DJs, they take them out of the sleeve and they hold them by the edges. They'll very gently lower them on the record. They'll take their $100 cartridges and lower it down at exactly the right spot. They might go backwards a little bit, but if you did that with a $100 moving coil cartridge, you'd probably break the cartridge, and that's $100 down the drain. Whereas hip-hop DJs, they're constantly going forward, they're going back, they're scratching, and they needed the conical needles that I was talking about last week that wouldn't pop out when you went backwards, and they needed something with a lot of torque so that they could find the beginning of a song, for instance, and figure out where that first beat is. So that when one song ends, usually it's not even the whole song, it's like the hook of the first of one song ends, they can immediately cut over to the next song. very precisely. In order to accomplish that, the Grandmaster Flash is holding up an SL23. You have to remember he's like a teenager at this point, but he was very, very sort of analytical, engineering-minded teenager. He found that this turntable, of all the ones that he could find in his local store, had enough torque for the record to get up to full speed in about 1/4 of a rotation. He just put like a ballpoint pen on the record and saw how fast it went. This is actually a belt drive turntable. However, it sort of started getting DJs to focus on turntables that could provide a lot more torque rather than turntables that had really, really good vibration isolation. So vibration would still remain a problem, although eventually there will be turntables that kind of did well on both counts, torque and vibration isolation. This is what was underneath the turntable that I had out last week, where the motor is actually directly underneath the platter, and the platter securely hooks onto a center spindle and becomes like a solid piece. The entire platter becomes part of the motor. And you've just got a bunch of electromagnets that's all being fired in sequence. So that's forcing the entire thing around. This gives you way higher torque. And that's the reason why the turntable that I had out last week was an industry standard. That was the Technics SL1200, the Mark II model. But this was the standard for several decades. All DJs, any club, any hip-hop DJ, they will just get that, because it had the highest torque at the time when it shipped. And even though higher torque turntables came out after that, people just got used to how this turntable felt when they were scratching, when they were queuing up records. It didn't matter whether you were a disco DJ, or a house DJ, or a techno DJ, or a hip-hop DJ. Everyone was just using this. Or the European version, which was in black in color and ran on European voltages, basically. That's the only difference between the European version and the American version. You saw the little light that allows you to illuminate where the needle comes onto the record. You've also got a fairly long pitch fader. This will allow you to control how fast the turntable is spinning. And of course, if it's running faster, it's playing the record faster than usual, and then you will hear the pitch of that music go up. That's high pitch, low pitch. Right. That's what a pitch fader does. It speeds things up, it slows things down, but it also changes the frequency of what you're hearing. Which is interesting because a lot of DJs primarily think of it as a tempo change slider. And with modern digital technology now, it is possible to actually change the speed of a song without changing the pitch of the song. But over in the 70s and the early 80s, that was just not true. If you change the speed, you change the pitch at the same time, which is why it's called a pitch slider and not a tempo slider. That idea of a long vertical slider exists in pretty much all DJ hardware after this turntable. This set the standard, and you'll see it. In some cases, it's a little bit shorter. In some cases, it might be turned horizontally because a lot of DJs would actually turn their turntables horizontally. But it's basically the same idea. You have a left and right. Tends to go from +8 to -8%, but I've also seen +16 or +6%, -16%. And even something called ultra pitch, where it goes like -50% or something like that. It's like you can make a track half time or double its speed, for instance, which is a little bit crazy, but I'm sure there's applications for it. What application would this possibly have for a home user? Why would a home user care about the pitch of their music? Something that was happening in the 80s that was very popular. This is a Japanese company because maybe you had to sing along to it. Karaoke. This is a karaoke turntable. That's what this was designed for. It was never designed for DJs again. All right? And it was designed for home users to be able to adjust how high or how low a song was so that they could match their own vocal singing range and sing along to it. Somehow became the worldwide DJ standard. Now, when you buy a turntable that's not designed for DJ use, and remember all those turntables were not designed for DJ use, they're designed for home hi-fi. You get a big, heavy rubber sheet like this to sit between your record and the platter. Again, vibration isolation, but also to provide enough friction so it doesn't slip when it's spinning underneath your record. DJs need it to slip. They need to be able to go backwards, they need to go forward, and they need the platter to keep rotating even while the record is stationary. That's where slip mats come in. It's a piece of felt. The version that we use is the version that Grandmaster Flash basically popularized, although there have been some refinements since. He basically got a piece of felt, he sprayed it with starch to give it a little bit more rigidity so it wasn't completely floppy, and it would stay on the platter even while you removed records. So I just took the record off. The slip mat didn't come with it. In many other materials, there'll be like static cling, so that you pull it off and then it comes with it, and then you have to put it back again, which is really annoying. The other thing that Grandmaster Flash did was that he added a layer of wax paper, just like kitchen wax paper, again cut out in a circle to further reduce the amount of friction between the record and the platter. Nowadays, we use polyethylene sheets. This is the same material that you find protecting records. A lot of records at a time, they come shipped in polyethylene sheets just like this. All a lot of DJs will do is they cut a circle out of that, add that underneath the slip mat. And that gave them even less friction. Grandmaster Flash, he would use a crayon, and eventually DJs will start using stickers. Often the stickers that you will find in cassette tapes. And they would label it. And this would allow them to figure out where the beginning of the sound or the beginning of the song will be visually, instead of doing it entirely by ear. So if I play this, I know there's a sound that begins right where this label actually points at my needle. That's the beginning of the sound. I can visually see where the beginning of that sound is. I don't have to rely entirely on sort of listening to my headphones, which is a little bit slower, right? There's actually a trick to stick label right onto the record, and it will actually bump against the needle to make sure that you always land in the correct groove. It's a little finicky. Traditional hip-hop standard is to have 2 turntables, whereas previously you saw the disco standard, which was to have 3 turntables. But even the DJs that had 3 turntables were typically only playing 2 turntables at a time. The third one's for redundancy. In case one breaks, there's always another one to go. It might be the needle that breaks, someone spills a drink on it or something like that. You still have one more turntable. There are disco DJs who will use that third turntable for sound effects. So they will do something like the sound of a train, or the sound of an aircraft, or a rainforest, or a thunderstorm, or something like that. And these are massive, massive sound systems. A thunderstorm could sound louder than a real thunderstorm. It will be a sensational experience for people in the disco, and they will have that queued up on the third turntable. In this particular case, it's 2 of the same record to allow them to loop songs. So the idea is that if there's only 8 bars of a really, really hot beat, they will play those 8 bars on one side, and then they'll flip it over to the next side and play those same 8 bars over and over again. And so if it's, say, an instrumental, a breakbeat, let me see if I've got a good breakbeat anywhere here. So in this case, I have a record that's just the same beat throughout. But hip-hop DJs didn't have records like this. They would have those 8 bars at the beginning of a song or somewhere in the middle of a song. And then the vocals will come back in, the instruments will come back in, and then the hot breakdancing part of the song will be over. So what they do is they have 2 copies of the same record and loop it constantly back and forth. And they wouldn't necessarily always play it exactly the same way back and forth each time. When we get to cutting and scratching later in the semester, I'll actually show you some of the techniques of how they used to do that and what that sounds like. But that also means that you needed to have 2 copies of the same record, which is not always easy to find in an environment where music is scarce, right? A record store might only have 1 copy of a given record, and in order to find that second copy, you might have to go to a different record store. And that's one thing that DJs did. They had to hunt around. That still exists. This whole idea of like chasing around. Now we do it, with things like Amazon, and there's a website called Discogs, which is a very expensive way to find rare music, but it's probably the most convenient way to find rare music. Much cheaper to go to a place like Goodwill, or a record store in Boston. There's actually a lot of different CD and record stores that still exist, and just try to look in their bargain bin and see what's been marked down. And you can get a lot of good music that way. DJs will deliberately conceal what records they had. They'll go over it with tape and markers and stuff like that. They will try to prevent other DJs from figuring out what records they had, right? Everyone could hear the record, but just because you heard the record doesn't mean that you knew where that record came from. There was no Shazam at the time, right? So, either you already knew the record and you already had a copy of it and you learned about it, or it was a complete mystery to you and you just liked the beat and you saw how the audience responded, but then you wouldn't be able to necessarily ask for this record in the store. I have heard of some DJs actually making fake labels so that certain other DJs will go looking for the wrong artist, for instance. There's this guy over here who's just trying to see what record that this DJ is playing right now by looking at the LED screen. And now we have Shazam. I know there are some DJs who hate that. They hate people Shazamming in the middle of their set because, one, they would like to keep certain songs exclusive to themselves. But secondly, you don't want to be DJing in an environment where everyone's like on their phone. It's like you don't know if they really like the music because they're Shazamming it, or they really hate the music and are bored. I think the reality is that that's the world we live in right now. And I actually like the assumption that other DJs are going to figure out what it is that I'm playing as a way to spread the music that I love. When I do a live stream, for instance, you can actually see what song I'm playing on screen because then you don't even have to Shazam it. But for DJs who really, really want exclusivity, they'll make their own remixes. They'll make their own edits. They'll make their own versions of songs. They'll take a certain popular song, take out the drums, put in a new instrumental. It screws up the algorithm. You might be able to figure out where this original instrumental came from, but you wouldn't be able to figure out what this entire track is. Well, that's one reason why DJs make edits, is that exclusivity again. There's other reasons, and we'll get to that later in the semester. So if you just want to make one record, what do? One, you could do what I talked about last week. You can make a lacquer, right? An aluminum plate with a layer of lacquer on top of it. It's warmed up. You cut one groove. That's what they normally do as the first step of the record pressing stage. And that will play, but it will degrade. Every time you play it, the soft lacquer starts to wear down. You lose those high frequencies. Alternatively, you could attempt to cut it directly into vinyl using a slightly different cutting stylus, again with a lot of heat lamps, and you make a one-off vinyl cut of your music. It doesn't necessarily even need to be vinyl. This is actually X-ray film over here that was taken by someone who really loved American rock and roll when I was living in Russia. And this was the only way that that collector could get their music copied onto X-ray film, and that will actually play. That's called riobra, or rib music. Different competing sound crews in Jamaica trying to get one up on their competition. These groups are called sound systems, partly because they had a sound system, a giant, massive wall of speakers, amplifiers, record players. Originally started as a way for record stores to draw customers in, right? You hear the music coming down the street through a couple of large speakers. You want to find out where that music is coming from. You show up and there's a record store, or a little mobile record store like this. Eventually, people realize this is a great way to make money, and they will just start throwing events that way. They'll set up the sound system. People will show up, and they'll sell them drinks and food. It's a great way for people to enjoy something socially. And this is kind of the backbone of Jamaican music culture. I think I've mentioned Soundclash a few times, and that's basically a competitive environment where you have multiple sound systems all set up within earshot with each other. Often, it's actually organized between the sound systems in order to sort of draw people to the same event. So the idea is that you, instead of just seeing a party, you're actually seeing a competition, right? And both sound systems, or maybe multiple sound systems, are bringing out their best music to try to win the crowd over. There's a few different versions of that, but the Jamaican version owns the word Soundclash. We've also seen versions of that in the UK, in the Bay Area. There's a couple of events like that as well. Dub plates were cut in order to show that a certain sound system had access to certain artists. And the way they do it is they would hire those artists, or in some cases as a favor, to re-sing their song over the same backing track. So the instrumental part of these records was exactly the same. They sing a song that was popular, so most of the verses are the same, but they would insert the name of that sound system into the lyrics and make a custom version of that song. So as a result of that, they had a copy of a song that no one else could play. Nobody else should want to play the song because it's shouting out, it's basically advertising for your own sound system. And there are some DJs who still continue to build up their dubplate collection. So just to show that I have access to these singers, or I have access to these particular artists. And for artists, especially people who work in dance hall, people who work in reggae, it's a great secondary source of revenue, right? You pay me, I'll record a dubplate for you. I've got my backing tracks. I just have to sing a few new verses on top of that. Let's talk about crates. This is like the traditional hip-hop carrying case, which is just the milk crate that you stole from the milkman. The big problem with it is that it's not 12 inches this way. It's more than 12 inches this way, and it's not quite 12 inches this way. So if I actually try to completely pack this crate, it will be at an angle. Yeah, you can sort of see it over there. All the records are kind of at an angle, which is not great. The other thing is that they don't quite come up to the top of the record, so you can't really stack them. Otherwise, you're putting weight directly on the record, and you end up bending it. There are, of course, made for DJs carrying cases. These are travel crates. And bags. And there's a special kind of crate specifically for vinyl collectors called the S crate, which is taller than a regular record, and it's actually 12 inches by 12 inches, so that you can actually fit records quite nicely in them. These sorts of crates still have an iconic presence in DJing, even if you don't use vinyl. If you load up a piece of software like Serato, which is one of the most popular DJ softwares out there, instead of folders or playlists, they have crates. They're exactly the same thing as a music playlist. Exactly the same thing as a folder of music. But that terminology still exists. I'm going to be introducing you to terms that were invented a long time ago, that they're barely relevant now, but people still call them that. In the same way that DJs call the pitch fader a pitch fader, even though they use it only to adjust tempo nowadays. So hopefully that sort of makes sense. To locate records quickly, DJs will sort of like add labels to them and add information to them that they needed to find in a hurry. This might be something like, this is a pretty generic record cover for a 12-inch single. It doesn't have the title of the artist on it at all. So whoever owned this record last, they've got the artist, they've got the track in here. So this might be side A, side B, and the tempo. They wrote 62. I would probably have written this down as 124 beats per minute. So they were doing beats per half minute, I guess. This is actually a white label record. So the entire sleeve is white. It was a sleeve like that. Only some DJs printed that out. More likely they'll write it out by hand. You'll also have to do with your music when you are DJing. You're going to have to figure out how fast the song is. You might be interested in knowing what key that song is, but more importantly, knowing which are the tracks you want to play and which are the ones that you don't, and organizing it in some playlist, in some digital crate. Software does make this a little bit easier, but it still does take work on your part. Even if you're getting the music to analyze how fast a song is, you have to verify that it got it right, and that takes time.